speaker tonight is Professor Kecia Ali. She is a professor of religion and chair of the religion department at Boston University. Her research ranges from Islam's formative period to the present and focuses on Islamic law, gender and sexuality, and religious biography. She is the author of several books, including Marriage and Slavery in Early Islam and Sexual Ethics and Islam, Feminist Reflections on the Quran, Hadith, and Jurisprudence. Her current projects include an introductory book on women in Muslim traditions and a study of the gender politics of academic Islamic studies. She recently completed a term as Status Committee Director for the American Academy of Religion and is a past president of the Society for the Study of Muslim Ethics. And tonight's lecture is based on her book, The Lives of Muhammad, an amazing book about which I'll say more later when Kecia and I will have a conversation. But for now, I leave you in the able hands of Professor Ali, and please help me welcome her virtually to the center. Thank you.
Thanks very much. First of all, thank you, Professor Majid, and thanks to the Center for Global Humanities for hosting me, sort of, as much as anybody hosts anybody in this very strange Zoom world we're living in. Now, in the decades since I began speaking sort of regularly about Muhammad in lead up to writing my book, anti-Muslim and anti-immigrant sentiment in the US and beyond has risen really dramatically. And so I want to just begin tonight by acknowledging that this is a fraught topic. And anti-Muslim vandalism, harassment, and violence have risen precipitously, even in Massachusetts, since the lead up to the 2016 election. Rhetoric from individuals and groups ranges from merely ugly to murderous to genocidal. In December 2016, shortly after the last election, my mosque got a letter saying that Trump would do to Muslims what Hitler did to the Jews. And in 2017, I got a hand-addressed letter in my university mailbox from a self-described infidel who said he and others were armed, locked, and loaded. The letter was scribbled on the back of a hate group flyer, and it took the time to levy specific insults, including pedo-pervert, against Muhammad. Accusations of sexual deviance are, of course, a time-honored tactic in interreligious polemics, but their specific contours in this instance aren't a manifestation of some timeless antagonism between Islam and the West, about which we hear an awful lot. Rather, they are very much an artifact of their time and their place, as I'll talk about in my remarks this evening. So in The Lives of Muhammad, the book which you so helpfully used for show and tell, I look at how the Prophet Muhammad's life has been understood over the centuries by a wide variety of writers, and especially how, in the last 2 centuries, Muslim and non-Muslim, especially European and North American non-Muslim perspectives on his life have grown closer. And that might seem counterintuitive given what I just said about contemporary anti-Muslim sentiment. But what I mean is that looking at how Muhammad's life has been told and retold reveals transformations and fault lines within Western societies as well as among Muslims. And we see how ideas about Muhammad that many contemporary Muslims hold fervently and defend passionately actually arose in tandem with Western European and North American intellectuals' portraits of him. Now, before the colonial era, when European powers conquered and occupied many Muslim-majority societies in Africa and Asia, polemical non-Muslims and hagiographical Muslim accounts of Muhammad's life flowed in largely separate streams. Muslim writing about the Prophet included biographies which recounted the events of his life, but these narratives coexisted with other, more influential stories, including about his night journey and ascension to heaven. Muhammad's role as intercessor for Muslims on the Day of Judgment, as the original light in creation, God's beloved, and the perfect mirror of divine beauty, among similar attributes, were far better known, Anne-Marie Schimmel writes, to the medieval Muslims than the historical facts of the Prophet's life. At the same time, during the first centuries of Islam's existence, Europeans knew little and cared less about accuracy in what they had to say about Muhammad. They associated him with paganism and idolatry. Somewhat later, medieval European polemics commingled fact and fabrication. As the Crusades increased European familiarity with Muslim beliefs, and paganism became less of a concern for Christians than dissent and heresy, Muhammad was refashioned into a heresiarch, an antichrist, and a false prophet. By the early modern era, roughly between the Reformation and the French Revolution, he'd become a fraud. We see over and over when we look at these European accounts of Muhammad's life that their writers, who were often clergy, tailored their accusations about Muslims and Muhammad to current local theological and social worries. They used Islam as a foil to address the preoccupations closer to home. So for Protestants, Muhammad and the Pope were twin antichrists. Or jumping forward to the 19th century and across the Atlantic, anti-Mormon polemicists called the latter-day American prophet, Joseph Smith, the Yankee Muhammad. So this kind of insult has, of course, persisted as the Enlightenment transformed ideas about religion. More recently, humanistic European and North American thinkers came to see Muhammad as sincere and as merely one of the founders of world religions, a category which is itself a modern invention and part of the rise of the academic study of religion. The Muhammad that these scholars sought was the historical Muhammad, who Muslim and non-Muslim scholars alike often portrayed as a political and military leader and social reformer. This is different from and distinct from the luminous Muhammad, who has remained a key part of Muslim devotion, but this isn't the Muhammad who typically shows up in biographies, which typically focus on his deeds. The publication by European scholars of early Muslim historical and biographical texts generated new ways of interacting with these sources and a great deal of argument, polemic, and exchange between Muslim and non-Muslim scholars and pundits. And today, some of my colleagues in Islamic studies are working with these and other sources to try to retrieve a very accurate biography of Muhammad and knowledge of Islam from these 7th, 8th, even 6th century sources. Their debates are ongoing and contentious, and some argue vociferously that we can know nearly nothing with any degree of certainty about Muhammad's life. And others are fairly confident in the possibilities for reconstructing a solid account of who he was and what he did. But these are specialist squabbles, and they've had remarkably little effect on how most accounts of Muhammad's life proceed. Because I know that there will be folks in the audience who are unfamiliar with the key points of this account that I want to talk about later, I'm going to give a very quick summary. Muhammad was born into a poor branch of a noble family, orphaned while young. He was employed by and then married to the wealthy widow Khadijah when he was 25 and she was 40. They had 2 or 3 sons who died in infancy and 4 daughters. After some years, he began meditating in a cave in the outskirts of Mecca, where when he was 40, he had some kind of an experience. Muslim sources say he was visited by the angel Gabriel, who brought him the first verses of the Quran. Muhammad sought solace and reassurance from Khadijah, then began to preach, preaching the oneness of God, the inevitability of judgment, and his preaching with egalitarian undercurrents attracted converts among the disadvantaged and hostility from local elites, in part because his nascent religion threatened the economy, which depended on pilgrims visiting the Kaaba, a bastion of idolatry. Hostility turned to persecution after the deaths in 619 of both Khadijah and his uncle. He remarried Sauda, a widow, and Aisha, the young daughter of his close friend and follower, Abu Bakr. He and his family and followers emigrated to Medina, where he eventually married several more times. He led the community politically as well as religiously, alternately cooperated with and fought local Jewish tribes, and feuded and engaged in warfare with Arab pagans, capturing Mecca in 630. When he died in Medina 2 years later, Islam already dominated much of the Arabian Peninsula. Today, most biographies, whether in Arabic or English, by Muslims or non-Muslims, in Wikipedia or in textbook, journalistic accounts or PBS documentaries, stick fairly close to this outline, providing more or less detail as the genre demands. Hostile biographers weave a tapestry of improper motives and acts around this work, while pious accounts embroider it with evidence for Muhammad's prophetic status and extraordinary virtues. They may also add details of certain miraculous, religiously meaningful experiences, but not always. Despite these important differences in tone, the contours of the story are largely the same, and they're derived from a handful of 8th, 9th, and 10th century texts. The details are old, but their selection and arrangement is new. And particularly distinctive, and what I'll say most about this evening, is the central focus on Muhammad's marriages, sometimes separated into a thematic chapter, and also distinctive, the disproportionate attention given to Khadijah. Muhammad's modern biographers, whatever their intent, whether hostile or laudatory, saw his character manifested in his relationships with women, first and foremost Khadijah, but also, and as a clear contrast, his other wives as a group. And my favorite example of the centrality of his marriages is an early 20th century Egyptian biography titled The Genius of Muhammad. And when it was published, there were vibrant public debates going on about sovereignty and politics and power. But the author of this book devotes nearly 10 times as many pages to Muhammad as a husband as he does to Muhammad as a leader. Now, why were Muhammad's wives and marriages so important? It's particularly because the woman question in Islam had become prominent. Now, as Moja Kaf has shown, the medieval and early modern Muslim woman was portrayed as a termagant by Europeans. And the oppressed but alluring Muslim woman, as Leila Ahmed and others have shown, is an invention of colonialism. And as Muslim biographers in the late 19th and especially 20th century began to engage directly with European scholars and critics, they began reformulating their approaches to Muhammad's life to refute perceived errors of interpretation. Thus, Khadijah becomes a pious, active female role model, and Muhammad, as her husband, a new kind of modern man. Now, there are a variety of ways these things manifest in sympathetic modern accounts of Muhammad's life, including by non-Muslims, but they all tend to emphasize his marriage to Khadijah. And this might seem like an obvious thing to do because by the usual reckoning, she was married to him for more than twice as long as any other woman. And of course, early sources associate her with crucial turning points in his life, his marriage, his prophetic commission, and then in the wake of her death, his departure from Mecca to Medina. But pre-modern accounts, while praising her and giving her epithets like Khadijah the Grand and Khadijah the Pure, tend to say relatively little about their conjugal life compared to the wealth of information about his later marriages, which transpired during the course of his public prophetic mission and leadership of the community. But for some modern authors, again, Muslim and non-Muslim, we see the importance of this marriage as a way to praise Muhammad as a husband and a man. So ancient depictions of Khadijah as comforter in the wake of Muhammad's first encounter with Gabriel become grounds for depicting comforting as a wifely duty and marriage as an institution designed to nurture emotional closeness, right? She's his faithful wife and helpmate, as Montgomery Watt puts it. Or as Pakistani author Jian Jalbani comments, she no doubt knew him better, as no one can be better informed of the ways of a man than his own wife, who is in a position to have free access to his heart. They're making Muhammad relatable. Now, these descriptions of marital intimacy and wifely comforting even take on religious overtones. So the Egyptian modernist Muhammad Hussein Haykal calls Khadijah an angel of mercy, a coinage which is strange enough that even though Arabic books typically omit vowel markers, the text provides them on the word angel to prevent misreading. And then we see other authors adopt the stock phrase angel of hope and consolation, which is a British 19th century phrase. We see it first in sympathetic non-Muslim books about Muhammad, and then in English language works by Muslim South Asians, sporadically up through the late 20th century. This imagery of a wife as an angel, however metaphorical, at least partially displaces the encounter with the actual angel, whose initial appearance had led Muhammad to seek her comfort. The emphasis, even in works by Muslims, has changed from the eruption of the divine into Muhammad's life to the importance of a domestic sanctuary where an angel of the hearth awaits him. These ways of speaking of Khadijah, of course, draw on early Muslim biographies that celebrate her pivotal role, but they're decisively modern in the way they depict Muhammad's marriages as the center of his emotional life, and the couple and the nuclear household as the proper pattern for family living. They're emphasizing Muhammad the man rather than Muhammad the prophet. It's a shift from type to individual. So what do these biographers do with the fact that in the wake of Khadijah's death, Muhammad remarries repeatedly? At that point, the perfect nuclear household and companionate marriage these authors envision becomes trickier to imagine, not only because his other wives didn't bear him children, but specifically because they're not monogamous. Now, there's a narrative link that goes back to early sources between Khadijah's death and Muhammad's remarriages, specifically to Aisha and Sauda. But those early works are concerned primarily with which contract was made first, and not at all with his motivations for contracting two marriages in quick succession. This is because the idea that polygamy itself was problematic and needed justification didn't occur to any of Muhammad's pre-modern Muslim biographers. They spent no time discussing it. But when hostile modern writers began to speculate about Muhammad's motives for these marriages, Muslim biographers also responded. So we have texts like the early hostile life written by the Anglican clergyman Humphrey Prideaux in 1697. He criticized Muhammad for having contracted multiple marriages for worldly aims. He was trying to tie himself to influential fathers-in-law. But by the 20th century, we see those concerned with defending Muhammad from what are now accusations of lustfulness, turning back to Prideaux's argument, and in fact holding the marriages blameless precisely because they were motivated not by lust, but by the desire to forge strategic alliances. Where lustfulness was the medieval and early modern accusation about Muhammad, by the late 19th century and into the 20th, polygamy became understood by critics of Islam not just as debauched, but as oppressive to women. Hence the emphasis by those biographers seeking a positive portrait on his long monogamous marriage to Khadijah, and then the political justification for his later marriages. Now, it's only quite recently, comparatively speaking, that Aisha's youth, which is the source of the insult in that threatening letter that I received, became a concern. In the second half of the 20th century and into the 21st, Aisha's age, which early Muslim sources mostly declare to have been 6 or 7 at marriage and 9 or occasionally 10 at consummation, was first flagged as a problem. So earlier critics like Prideaux had deplored Muhammad's calculated plotting to cultivate powerful allies, including Aisha's father. But Aisha's youth caused him no qualms. This is a quote from Prideaux. Aisha was but then 6 years old, and therefore he did not bed her till 2 years later when she was full 8 years old. For it is usual in those hot countries, as it is in India all over, which is in the same clime with Arabia, for women to be ripe for marriage at that age and also bear children the year following. We find similarly Orientalist allusions to climate's effect on maturation in the 1830s biography by George Bush, an American Methodist minister and distant relative of the recent President Bush, who remarks that Aisha was married, such as the surprising physical precocity peculiar to an Eastern climate, at the early age of 9 and survived her husband 48 years. And the novelist Washington Irving, who's a rough contemporary of Bush, is likewise untroubled. As he puts it, echoing Prideaux and Bush, the female form is wonderfully precocious in the quickening climates of the East. Now, there were other authors, other biographers, less interested in titillating accounts of the precocious development of young girls in what Prideaux called the torrid zone. But they still raised no objections to Aisha's age. And the book gives a lot of examples here. Even as late as the 70s and 80s, American and British biographers gave accounts of Aisha's childish habits without giving excessive condemnation or extensive condemnation. But by then, sensibilities had shifted, and not only among Westerners. It had become increasingly common over the preceding century for accounts, including by Muslims, to refer to the original contract as a betrothal and the consummation as marriage. In the 1960 Arabic translation of Washington Irving's book, a translator's note appears discussing Aisha's age at betrothal and marriage. So what was acceptable for Americans in the 1850s was troubling for Egyptians a century later. Now, by the last decade of the 20th century, and especially the first decade of the 21st, Aisha's age had become a favorite argument of anti-Islam polemicists, especially but not exclusively online. In 2002, the Reverend Jerry Bine's Southern Baptist Convention speech called Muhammad, quote, a demon-possessed pedophile. Vine's accusation is interesting because it merges this new epithet with an old slander, the medieval charge of demon possession. When challenged, Vine cited early texts, these early Arabic biographies, texts which contain facts available to Western biographers for centuries, who'd repeated them, as we saw, without any particular condemnation. Now, those who wanted to contest Vine's argument took two tacks. One was historical contextualization, things were different then, or arguing that these particular texts were not reliable sources of facts. Some Muslim rejoinders to Vine's, for instance, rejected the particular accounts on which his story of Aisha's marriage was based, as do a number of more recent biographies, which tend to cite other reports or to challenge those ages based on the timing of different events in early Muslim history. But what's striking to me is that even as people disagree about how reliable specific texts are, they all agree, nearly everyone agrees, that these authentic texts contains facts, which are how one knows and judges key elements of Muhammad's life. So to wrap up, and then we can have a conversation. Women and sex remain very much key loci for criticism of Muhammad, even as medieval emphases on debauchery and lustfulness become modern concern with oppression. Looking back from our vantage point, it may be nearly impossible to understand how, in the middle of the 19th century, evangelist and British colonial official and Arabic scholar William Muir was untroubled by Aisha's youth, but highly critical not only of polygamy, but also of divorce, which he thought debased women. Today, divorce carries very little stigma, and even polygamy is quaint but unthreatening in a lot of contexts. We see it on television dramas and reality shows as an exotic curiosity. On the other hand, what previous generations treated as child marriage, a primitive practice to be eradicated by the adoption of progressive Western norms, has become abuse, or most frighteningly put, pedophilia. So by the 20th century, Muhammad had largely stopped being viewed as evil, even by people who didn't much approve of him. But the rise of the pedophile epithet, largely after 9/11, had to do with a resurgence of the idea of evil and the idea of a link between evil and Islam. And I don't think it's coincidental that use of this label surged after the US clergy sex abuse scandal. Anti-Muslim and anti-Catholic sentiments, which deserve a full exploration in themselves, remain connected. Muhammad's marriage to Aisha has become, for contemporary polemicists, a firm and unbreachable barrier to any attempt to portray Muhammad as an admirable figure. All of these contemporary polemics about Muhammad's marriages draw from an unwieldy jumble of incompatible discourses, which have in common mostly that they provide a language to denigrate others. The historian John Toland, who's the reigning expert on medieval Christian accounts of Muhammad, suggests that, and I'll quote him, European discourse concerning Muhammad is often best understood as a deforming mirror. And I agree. What we celebrate or repudiate in Lives of Muhammad may or may not, and probably more often doesn't, correspond to a real individual on the other side of the text. But it does give us, I think, a really fascinating glimpse of our own preoccupations.
Wow. Thank you so much. Thank you, Kecia. So I want to begin this session by saying I don't think I remember reading a conclusion of a book that has had such a tremendous impact. It was so satisfying. It was so it was just it was enjoyable to an extent that I really, at the end of it, I wrote bravo at the end of it. Because what you did is, after talking about different aspects of Muhammad's life and how the complexities and the transformation of the biographies and so on, you bring everything together in the end in a literary tour de force. I would say it's like it's high literature. I mean, it's high literary analysis. I don't know whether you would agree with me, but it's amazing. So I'm going to start with a couple of specific questions because they're striking. One sentence is especially striking in the conclusion, and then, if you don't mind, we'll just have a series of reflections, open-ended kind of conversation around these themes. The striking, I wrote, statement you make here is modern Islam is a profoundly Protestant tradition.
Okay, all right. So that one gets me the most questions, maybe, of anything that put in the conclusion. I stand by it.
Yes.
Although I think I should really say modern Sunni Islam,
yes,
to be a little more precise.
And you do say that.
Certainly, it's not the case that you can make a complete analogy. But I also think some of the same things that made Protestantism, which is to say the availability of scripture in vernacular languages, the importance of text, the idea of really almost sort of DIY exegesis, those are patterns that we see very much in Muslim communities. I mean, somebody who knows Catholicism will have to tell me whether modern Catholicism is also a profoundly Protestant tradition, right? I do think that some of what I'm talking about when I'm talking about Protestantism owes to the coexistence of a variety of trends that come to the fore. But I do think that looking at biographies and biographies alone doesn't at all give us the complete picture of devotion to Muhammad that continues to suffuse many Muslim societies. I think it gives us a slice of what we talk about when we talk about Muhammad in today's world.
Okay, what is striking also in your book is like you play with these biographies, you put them together, you look at them side by side, and you go back and forth in time and do all kinds of things with these biographies. Until when we come to the modern period, something very interesting happens. It looks like, it seems to me, as if everybody, whether it's Westerners and Muslims, are writing the same, are using the same genre, basically, to tell the story of the Prophet. So, let's say, beginning in the 19th century, it seems to me that everybody was writing a Western-style biography of the Prophet. What do you think?
Well, So I think there are two Western texts that are two texts. One by a Brit and one by an Egyptian, which is sort of fitting, right? That I think are turning points. I think William Muir's 4-volume Life of Muhammad, based on the original sources, which he publishes in 1860s in India, where he's been stationed as a colonial officer, where he begs manuscripts from Indian Muslims who've had them in some cases in their families, right? He goes to all of this trouble. He's a committed Christian who thinks that part of his job, part of his mission is to evangelize. He's initially contracted to write a missionizing life in a vernacular language, and he decides he can't do that. So he wants to write, a life of Muhammad that will convince Muslims to convert to Christianity. Okay, but he's also a trained Arabist, right? And so he gets his hands on these early sources, and he tries to, on the one hand, be scrupulously responsible to his sources, but on the other hand, show that Muhammad is bad and Muslims should convert, right? And so he produces this kind of tour de force biography that sets historicity of these materials as a criterion with which all later biographers have to contend. So this really changes the playing field, and we start to see a lot more books that are, a lot more biographies that are really focused on what can we reliably know and what does this tell us? And so we get concerns about the truth of his prophecy, but then also his personal behaviors. It's not an accident, of course, that this is sort of the historical Jesus time, right? I mean, Muir is here in sync with broader trends in the study of religious figures and of biblical traditions and so forth. So this happens in the 1860s. The other biography, this is where I argue that you start to really see the melding and merging of these traditions. The other biography, the point at which I think you can no longer speak about a separate Muslim and non-Muslim biographical tradition, is Muhammad Hussein Hakel's 1935 Hayat Muhammad, right? It's Life of Muhammad in just simply translated into Arabic. That is not a traditional title for a biography. You call them, the Sirah of the Prophet or prophetic Sirah or something that has a grounding, right, in the Arab Muslim tradition. Now, Hakel, no, it is a direct Arabic translation of English and French European biographies titled. And that's very fitting because his biography actually originates as a series of long critical responses published in periodical reform to a French biography by Émile Durmingham. By this point, it's just all one kind of thing. And Hakel's biography was deeply controversial when it appeared, and now it's sort of an old favorite in a lot of instances. And it was a thoroughly, not a desanctified Muhammad exactly, but a disenchanted one in the sense that this Muhammad was not a figure of miracles, was not a figure of cosmic light. He was a social reformer. He was a political leader, right? He was a man. And the story of his life was told as the story of a man, an extraordinary man, but a man.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about that too with the different kind of the kinds of virtues that were valued in the 19th century and so on. How Muslims continuously respond to that and trying to prove the case and so on. One of the things that strike me about this conclusion, and all the entire book actually, is how eventually people end up being trapped in discursive traditions, not of their own making. Let's say the Western tradition. For example, one of the interesting facts that you mentioned more than once is that religion, the very notion of religion itself, is a recent creation concept. That there wasn't people before that didn't think of Islam as a religion the way we think of it today because of the tradition. I always used to tell people, students, just for fun, I would say in 1850, for example, or thereabouts, people didn't have an ego. Nobody had an ego because they simply didn't exist as a concept. So when concepts come into existence, they do something to histories, to the ways people relate to themselves and the tradition. So you say here, I'm going to quote you again, and I'm going to ask you to comment a little bit. There was no pure Islamic tradition prior to the encounter with Western modernity.
Okay. I can say something about that.
Okay.
One of the biggest challenges for anybody who wants to talk to Muslims or non-Muslims about Islam in the world is this idea that there is Islam and then there's outside of Islam, right? And that if we talk about Islam and the West, there's this hermetically sealed entity called Islam that's colliding with this other hermetically sealed entity called the West. And neither one of those things is true, right? The very earliest Muslim community, the community around Muhammad, right, was a community that was negotiating Arabic tradition, new religious traditions, right? We're dealing with what practices can continue and what must stop. So does that mean that if something was an Arabic tradition that Muhammad didn't stop, right, that now it is Islamic? And what does that do when you move to another part of the world? That question about religion and culture is really, really tricky. But for purposes of this book, specifically what I wanted to make really clear is that there's a tremendous amount of internal Muslim diversity in terms of how Muhammad gets portrayed. That changes over time, long before we have encounters with Europeans, right? So even if you're looking at the difference between Ibn Ishaq's earliest biography and then Ibn Hisham's slightly later recension of that biography, right, which takes things out and puts things in, there's already been a shift in terms of what's perceived as the most efficacious way to make clear what a really cool guy Muhammad is.
Yes.
So, it's not a surprise, it shouldn't be a surprise that these boundaries around traditions are much more fraught than we think. The other thing that I really didn't do much of in this book, but I think others have done, and I hope will continue to do, is that we often talk about Islam and the West as though that's the only meaningful kind of cultural encounter. First of all, when we say Islam, we mostly mean the Arab Muslim Middle East. And we say the West, we mostly mean like Northern Europe, maybe Central Europe and North America, and actually really just the US and Canada. We don't mean like Indonesia and Chile, right? That's not what we're talking about when we're talking about Islam.
Yes. Yes.
But those who study South Asia, those who study Sub-Saharan Africa, those who look at West Africa and East Africa, right? I mean, those who think about intra-Muslim encounters but also Muslim encounters with others who aren't Western others, I think fine that we also see really, really important, really, really interesting ways of thinking about who Muhammad is and what he does. And that those also get expressed in a variety of local idioms, right? Symbolic idioms, and of course, obviously, languages.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's so many provocative things you say here, and very insightful as well, like about the notion of this timeless clash of civilizations between Islam and the West. People who appeal to that, based on this notion also of a timeless Islam or a timeless image of Muhammad, and which absolutely, as you show, it's an ever-changing. Narrative about the story of Muhammad and what gets emphasized, what gets de-emphasized over time, and eventually the contact with the West does impel Muslims to somehow be on the defensive a little bit, to respond to this accusation, to respond to the narrative, to the distortions, and so on and so forth. But what's the idea that that I keep now. I'm gonna open it a little further. It's just as reflections on. It does seem to me, and I've said this privately to friends over time. I mean, as somebody who was a literary, comes from the literary tradition, biology in this case, which is the ultimate fact of existence, so to speak, really doesn't matter. I mean, to me, you implicitly, what reading your book, what comes out very strongly to me, and it's something that I've known instinctively and otherwise, even though before I read this book, is that nobody cares about biology. The fact that somebody was born and died between 570 and 60, whatever, 10, and so on, but people care mostly about biography, and biography is an ever-changing narrative that keeps changing. So it almost makes you wonder whether these figures we are defending, these prophetic figures we are defending, Jesus, Moses, Muhammad, are basically necessary for a culture to perpetuate, to preserve its traditions. And it's not necessarily about fact. You talk about devotional biographies, which eventually in the modern age become untenable because everybody's insisting on facts. Everybody wants facts. Everybody wants the truth. But you said for most of Muslim history, Muslims were not interested in the truth, the fact. They just wanted to experience the divine, and however it was, whatever narrative enabled them to do that, they were fine with it. What do you think about these ruminations? I don't know.
So I think it really depends who you're asking. And I will say, I don't think that devotional biography is dead. In fact, we recently read excerpts in a seminar I'm teaching this semester from a wonderful book called "In Praise of Prophetic Poems in Praise of Prophetic Action." Professor Ogunake is a scholar of, among other things, the West African poetic tradition. And so there are these lengthy poems that use accounts of elements of the prophet's life as points of departure for reflection and devotion. And they're meant to, yes, convey certain kinds of things, but also to induce certain kinds of affective states in the reciter and also in the audience. And so, those are really important things. And then on the other hand, there are folks like Sean Anthony, another colleague, who's published a book which is looking very much at evidence for the historical Muhammad, right? He's interested in what can we actually know, using a set of letters, right, from one of the members of his community. Can we authenticate these letters? What can we prove? What can we know? These are perhaps sort of polar opposites, but they are, I think, a complement to Marian Katz's book about the Mawlid, where she looks at the origins of the Mawlid tradition and contemporary celebrations of the birth of the Prophet Muhammad.
Yeah.
I mean, this is sort of sidestepping your question a little bit, because I think, are biographies necessary? Are these stories necessary? Absolutely, I think they are. Do they overshadow the historical figure? Probably. I mean, given my own tendency, given my own scholarly preoccupations, they certainly have in the things that I've written. But one thing that I have learned, if nothing else, in doing this project is that my perspective is always partial, and there is a wild and wonderful world out there of other people who care about very different things about the Prophet than I do. And they're doing really interesting and remarkable scholarly and cultural work with those things.
Today, I read an article in a Moroccan French language magazine. It's called Telkel. I don't know, probably you're familiar with it. And there's an article by an interview with Jacqueline Chaby, the French scholar. And she's like, I mean, very reasonably says that, the emergence of the Hadith and the Sirah, what they did is they sacralized history. In other words, there was a historical event in the life of Muhammad, and then by the time the Sirah was written and everything, they sacralized that history. So basically, you had a shift from the historical to the ahistorical. And now it seems to me I was thinking in light of reading your book, now we are trying to come back because of the Western discursive practices and cultural expectations. We are trying to come back to the historical. Well, how do you?
I don't think that's completely unfair.
Okay.
I also don't think that necessarily folks would have seen what they were doing as sacralizing in a meaningful sense. So, I wrote this book about biographies, but really, I'm a fiqh person, which is to say most of my scholarship is Islamic law and jurisprudence. And when I initially set out to write this book, I thought it was actually going to be a study of how Muslim jurists drew on Muhammad's example, and when they thought of him as exemplary and when they thought of him as exceptional. And that's really what I thought I was doing. And I think if we look at it through that lens, if we look at it through the lens of, 9th century jurists, so they're 200-300 years after Muhammad, they are concerned with, did he do this or did he do that? They're concerned with historicity, right? Because they want to know what's the precedent from which they're going to draw. This is not simply a question about, how do we create a sort of devotional portrait that will enable our worldview in this kind of, no, it's about, we need a rule about, rendering judgment among competing claimants for property, or we need a rule about rendering judgment in this kind of case, or we need to know how Muhammad allocated his time among his wives so that we can then have a role model, so that we can then have a norm that we appeal to, right? Or maybe don't, maybe he was exceptional and we don't have to. So I wouldn't necessarily take that sacralizing history, historicizing the sacred as applicable to all genres.
One of the people you mentioned in the book, I don't think you have a pause. You are let's say you're convinced by the argument, Robert Spencer's book, did Muhammad exist? And you used a description that I can't remember what it's like, but it was very, 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 again, very funny and made me laugh. But the question. Let's suppose theoretically, like we don't know, we don't have enough historical information about the life of the Prophet between the presumed date of 570 and 610, whatever, and 620, or 632. But does that matter? Since in light of what you're saying now about the biography, does it matter?
I think the question is, does it matter to whom, right?
Yes.
I think, look, there are serious scholars asking very real questions about the historical sources for the life of Muhammad. And it's not my area, so I'm not in a position to evaluate the strengths of the proof that they bring. There's a book called The Cambridge Companion to Muhammad that has some very good articles in it that lay out some of that evidence. Sean Anthony's new book, Stephen Shoemaker's book, Patricia Crona, of course, has written quite a good survey article that I think is accessible on that question to historians who are interested in late antiquity and early Islam. Yes, I think it matters very much to the 1.6 billion Muslims in the world. I think the question of, can you find historical evidence that proves, according to a particular standard of proof, whether or not Muhammad existed, the answer will be no, it doesn't.
Yes, that's what thank you. Yeah, I mean, and the question is also true for people like for other prophets, Jesus, Moses, Buddha, all for some reason, because you showed, and other people have shown it as well, you could see over time the figure of the prophet becomes more sacralized as we keep going. Qadi Ayyad, for example, who lived in Ceuta and probably died in Marrakesh, is one of the saints in Marrakesh. He's, I think, and I don't know, one of the books I've read, he's the one who added peace be upon him after every mention of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So it wasn't there. Nobody said it before, apparently. I don't know. I mean, that's so, yeah. So, and of course, he created a list of absolutely unacceptable behaviors towards the Prophet, many of which actually incur the death penalty or the death sentence. So, there is a secularization of the Prophet, over time, that makes you wonder whether those other people who are so preoccupied with historical facts and to get to the real what happened in 600 and 630 and when he died 632, whatever, but it almost seems to be slightly relevant to the discussion because people have created it's an experience that's not accessible. It's not accessible to this scientific, this insistence on absolute scientific purity.
So I think Muhammad, as I show in the book, and as my students and I were talking about today, gets used to define a lot of boundaries.
Yeah.
And so I think, when we're talking about penalties for insulting the Prophet, this is not something that sort of goes up or goes down in a neat line through history, right? It ebbs and it flows. It gets called into being in some contexts when people want to assert a particular kind of authority. So if we look at blasphemy laws in Pakistan, right?
Yeah.
We see they emerge at particular times. They are subject to popular feelings on one side or another. The same is true if we look at Andalusia, right? If we look at the moments at which there were public conflict over insult to the prophet, they're very specific, and you can look at what else is happening and how you trace the origins of these controversies. And that's the case with, many sorts of rules that seek to enforce cultural boundaries. If you look at, when are penalties for illicit sex being imposed? When are rules about interactions between Muslims and Dhimmis being implemented in particular kinds of ways? And while it's a very sweeping generalization, I am comfortable saying that often you find harsh penalties imposed, not when Muslim rulers feel very secure in their power, but precisely at the moments that they feel politically, economically, culturally threatened in some way.
Kecia, do you think we are comfortable, let's say members of the Muslim community, are comfortable with the notion that humans create their own history?
In what sense?
Well, I mean, in the sense that, I remember there was this kind of anecdotal information, or maybe not so anecdotal, like, when Marx was asked about how, God and so on, and he replied, he says, all I know is humans create their own gods. So in other words, because he's such a materialist in terms of his understanding and treatment of history. So, is it part of the tension? We write biographies in order to prove something to ourselves, to create something for ourselves, or is it we are writing biographies for some other metaphysical reason?
I think it depends on the biographer, of course.
Yes.
The authors of the praise poems,
yes,
that Professor Ogunike writes about and records and translates are doing something very different than Haeckel or Tamam Khan has a biography, a sort of collective biography of the wives of the Prophet, right? Yeah. Which is another kind of way of approaching him and of approaching that household, that community, that power, that meaning, right? That locus of devotion. I do think that if my book is successful, it makes it much harder to sustain the notion that any one biography gives us the scoop.
Yes,
right?
yes.
It gives us
yes.
the whole story.
Yes.
Are there some that feel closer to the mark than others? Are there some that are more responsible or less responsible to their sources? Absolutely.
Yes.
If my book is about anything, it's really about how much the biography reveals about its audience and also its author.
I taught English composition for many years at the university, and I always used to, again, just to be provocative with my students, used to say to emphasize the significance of the text, and I would say there is nothing beyond, just like I would say biology doesn't exist. There's nothing beyond the text. Even the Bible is called the scripture. And so, to ask, in the Christian context, and how do you know God exists? And they would say, oh, because it's in the Bible, And so, well, the text proves it. So, in other words, do we need our texts and to continually rewrite our texts to keep the faith alive?
think that's one reason that people write biographies of Muhammad, but I don't think it's just a question of faith. I think it's a question of reimagining our communities,
Communities.
but the Muslim community. But the Ummah is an abstraction
Yes.
that can be pressed into service to do really good things. And it also, I think, obscures the, again, tremendous diversity among Muslims, right? One biography does not fit all.
Yes. But every generation will write its own biographies of, I mean, whether it's Shakespeare or Napoleon or you know, Abraham Lincoln, there's this impetus. And if it were just about facts, you know, nobody, you know, people would have stopped a long time ago writing biographies about this great men or great women, the ones you mentioned in the book. So there is there is this need for each generation or for each to write its own story, basically, or to record its own story in relationship to the past.
I think that's right. But I also think, you know, facts can be, even the same set of facts can be put together and elaborated on and analyzed in a way that ends up giving a very different flavor,
Yes.
right? Very different result. And the other piece about fact, so, you know, in a longer presentation of the material about Muhammad's marriages and modern biographies, I like to talk about Khadijah. Any biography you read of Muhammad, he was 25, she was 40. He was 25, she was 40. He was 25, she was 40. Every single time, right? He didn't take another wife while she lived. He was 25, she was 40. Did I mention? Right? You know, that number is there in the early sources, although there are also a couple of mentions of like 28 or, you know, something else. So she was 40, right? This is what the texts say. You know, Muhammad was 40 when he had that first revelation. And you know, 40 is kind of a meaningful sort of round number in ancient context. Does it mean she wasn't 40? No. But the fact that she was 40 and supposedly bore him 6 or 7 children, right? It makes you sort of wonder, like, is she really older? Is she that much older? What's the meaning of this? And so the early ones don't really talk about it because they say she was 40 and they move on. But the modern sources, starting with modern Western sources, get really hung up on this. So she was 40 and he preyed on her vulnerability as an older widow, right, to get her to marry him. It's not very flattering to Khadijah. Or, you know, she was 40, so therefore he wasn't motivated by lust, because we all know that 40-year-old women aren't desirable, right? Thomas Carlyle, in his lecture on Muhammad, you know, in his series on heroes, says not that she was beautiful, but that she was still beautiful. I mean, that's really right? So then, you know, this is so interesting to me. So something that passes, that's there, but sort of passes in these texts that laud Khadijah for all these other reasons, right? Now becomes the source of a fact that can be marshaled to prove these other things about Muhammad, right?
Yes.
Including then by Muslims as well as non-Muslims, right? And so when did this become a fact as opposed to just something that was there, a ubiquitous fact?
Yes. As I talked, for some reason, when I talked about Khadijah, I thought of the Grand Inquisitor, Dostoevsky's novel, no, that's actually in the Brothers Karamazov. So when Jesus appears to the Inquisitor, says, you know, I didn't call for this punishment and for this treatment of people. And so he himself at that point was condemned by the church. And so in a way, it's a wonderful illustration of, you know, the inquisitor tells him, you just bring the message of peace and love, but we are the ones who are like, have to take care of business. And so in the end, is that the function of prophets? They bring the message of love and peace, and then human beings have to negotiate the rest? or the morals among us.
I mean, that's a potential question, right? There's a, I'm not sure I'm ready to pronounce metaphysically on that, but you know, we find an incredible array of things that people have found in Muhammad's life story, and of course in the Quran as well. And you know, whether that is, and I talk about it in the book a little bit, you know, the incredible general, the military strategist, the blooded warrior, or you know, the peaceful man who resorts to warfare only in self-defense. You know, we see these shifts over time alongside much broader questions about, you know, what does it mean to use violence, and who is allowed to, and under what circumstances, and how can it be justified?
Wow. I mean, I warned you before, I can go on forever with you. The book is so inspiring, it's so rich. And the style, the literary style is just incredibly, almost mesmerizing. I mean, I was home and I was just like delighted by the whole thing. So thank you so much. I wish you were here in person. We could take you to Portland. We have nice restaurants and everything. But we'll do that, I'm sure. I hope you'll accept to come back again when things...
I will be glad to take a rain check.
Yes. And so thank you so much again.